Wild salmon are in crisis. Atlantic salmon are now an endangered species in Great Britain. They have declined by around 70% in the last 25 years, and there is no sign of recovery. In Norway, Atlantic salmon stocks have more than halved since the 1980s. In the Pacific, many wild salmon populations are declining, and fish have been getting smaller, so there are fewer eggs to start the next generation. These magnificent fish are in danger of becoming extinct. The consequences cannot be underestimated. Wild salmon are a keystone species. They are essential for the health of our wider environment. Animals from bears to the freshwater pearl mussel depend on wild salmon for their survival. And they matter to us too. Wild salmon have been part of the human story for millennia. They are important culturally, spiritually, and economically. This is a crisis caused by human activity. The agriculture, forestry, and water industries pollute our rivers. Dams prevent wild salmon from migrating to their spawning grounds. Parasites and escapes from aquaculture threaten the wild salmon in rivers and coasts. At sea, salmon survival is affected by climate change and bycatch. Wild salmon are in crisis, but there is hope if we act now. Reducing pollution will provide cold, clean water for people and nature. Restoring river catchments will improve habitat for wildlife and local communities. Action to address climate change and biodiversity loss will also help safeguard wild salmon for future generations. At Wild Salmon Connections, we are urging immediate action. The Missing Salmon Alliance and our partners will work together to reduce impacts from industry to provide cold, clean water in rivers and coasts. Restore river catchments to create a healthy environment. Protect salmon at sea to safeguard the number of fish returning to our rivers. Wild salmon are in crisis, but there is hope. We must commit to bold action, and it must start now.
Good morning. My name is Mark Bilsby. I'm the CEO of the Atlantic Salmon Trust. And on behalf of the Missing Salmon Alliance and our organising parties, I'd like to warmly welcome you to Wild Salmon Connections. Firstly, we've received a message on behalf of His Majesty the King, and he would like me to pass on his warmest greetings to all those gathered for Wild Salmon Connections over the next few days. As the Prince of Wales, and now as the King, His Majesty has spoken passionately about the need to conserve the environment for future generations. The King recognises that everyone has a role to play in preventing climate change and biodiversity loss, such as that affecting our salmon populations in the United Kingdom and across the Northern Hemisphere. During his speech at the opening of COP28, His Majesty reiterated the urgency of these climate concerns and biodiversity issues, reminding us all of our collective responsibility. And in his words, the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. At this pivotal moment, the King continues to encourage us all to think about the many things that we can do to sustain and support the planet. His Majesty passes on his hopes that we will have a successful event and sends his warmest good wishes to all of you who have gathered for the conference and are so committed to providing a safe and sustainable future for us all. Thank you, Your Majesty. I now have the pleasure of introducing our host for this event over the next 3 days, Andrew Sutcliffe. Andrew is a barrister by profession. He joined the worshipful company of Fishmongers. This is their office. Rising through the company, becoming the chair of their charitable trusts, and onto his current role of prime warden. Just as importantly, his home is on the moors of Yorkshire, where he is a fellow beekeeper and cold water swimmer. So Andrew truly knows the value of maintaining biodiversity and looking after our rivers and seas. Andrew.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you all to Fishmongers Hall. The Fishmongers Company has had an unbroken relationship with the world of fish for 753 years. We've been located on or near this site, close to London Bridge, for most of that time. And this is currently our third, and it has to be said, most magnificent hall, which was completed nearly 200 years ago in 1835. It's wonderful to be able to welcome such a distinguished group of delegates and speakers from all over the world to discuss how we tackle the daunting problems facing a species which is surely the world's most iconic and remarkable fish. Countless millions of salmon will have, over the course of history, swum past this very spot up the Thames. But sadly, long gone are the days when the apprentices of medieval London demanded that they should not be made to eat salmon more than 3 times a week. Over the years, the Fishmongers Company has sought to bring together people and ideas to tackle some of the many problems facing our namesake trade. In the last century, the Salmon and Trout Association, the Atlantic Salmon Trust, the Freshwater and Marine Biological Associations, the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organisation were all founded through discussions in these rooms. And latterly, our members Simon Cairns and the chairman of the MSA, David Mayhew, here today, with our fisheries director, Andrew Wallace, to my right, came up with the idea of bringing all the organisations involved in salmon management here in the UK under a single umbrella, the Missing Salmon Alliance. Founded in 2019, we're delighted that this alliance is now reaching out to salmon scientists and managers all over the North Atlantic. But even more exciting is the extension of that dialogue and the building of relationships with our friends and colleagues in the Pacific, many of whom have made the long journey to be here with us today. The Pacific salmon species share so many of our challenges and indeed opportunities, and so it makes every sense to collaborate with those working in the Pacific region. This is one of the biggest conferences in recent times on the fortunes of the salmon. I'd like to thank all the organisations and people involved in convening such a distinguished group of ministers, ambassadors, politicians, scientists, managers, policymakers, and advocates for the salmon. It promises to be a stimulating and informative 3 days. Let's hope this collective endeavour can help inject a real sense of urgency and purpose about what can be done to reverse the alarming problems facing salmon stocks throughout the Northern Hemisphere. How good would it be if the apprentices of London once again had cause to complain about eating too much wild salmon? On behalf of the company, I thank you all for coming and wish you every success over the next 3 days. We at Fishmongers will do all we can to support you in making this a turning point in the fortunes of these magnificent fish. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for your very kind words and for hosting us all today. I have to say, the support of Fishmongers has been instrumental. We've just heard how it was instrumental in the formation of the Missing Salmon Alliance, but also in Wild Salmon Connections, providing that support and advice and that shoulder occasion. I extend that to Andrew as well. He's been incredibly helpful over the years in bringing it together. Put simply, if it wasn't for Fishmongers and the team that are in this building, we wouldn't be gathered here today, so thank you. Moving on, I'm afraid I've got some of the dreaded housekeeping. Firstly, there is CCTV in operation at all parts of the hall, and there are no fire drills planned for the day. In the event of the alarm sounding, it is not a drill, and you should find your nearest fire exit and make your way down to Fishmongers Wharf, which is by the side of the river. Don't worry, you will be guided by wardens in high-vis vests who will send you along the right route to get to. If any of you need first aid, well then please contact reception as you came in on the ground floor. If you have concerns about food allergies, please let one of the butlers know and they will answer any questions that you may have. And lastly, we are recording this event because there's a few people that haven't been able to attend in person. So we're wanting to share all of the stories and the lessons that we learned with them. And there are also a few journalists in the room. And if you want to speak to the journalists, there's a press room downstairs. So please make that available. So that's the housekeeping done. So what's this conference about? Over the next 3 days, you are going to hear a lot about the challenges that salmon face in the rivers and oceans of the Pacific and the Atlantic. And conferences are quite often criticised for being talking shops, talking to a preordained echo chamber where people are just all agreeing with each other. We are determined that Wild Salmon Connections is not going to be one of those. Okay? This gathering is about solutions and action. So the purpose of this conference is not to dwell unduly in the difficulties the salmon face, but to learn about the solutions, develop the connections, and that's the connections between all of us, to provide the means to unlock natural capital to deliver the cold, clean water that salmon from either ocean so desperately need. We have a mountain to climb here, and I'd like you to think of this conference as the base camp as we move forward. So we're asking you to do some things for us. We're asking you to think about the stories you're going to hear about wild salmon and what that means for the planet that we all belong to in terms of the health of our rivers and our oceans. We'd also like you to think about the solutions and how you can contribute to them, whether that's as an individual, an organisation, or part of the various governments and agencies that are in the room. And then we ensure that we deliver them at the scale and pace needed for salmon, people, and the planet. You'll have seen in the film, one of the key messages here is that there is hope. But it's up to the people in this room. You are the most influential people in the salmon world from around the northern hemisphere. We need you to rise to that challenge. Give hope to salmon and give them a future. So that's the purpose of the conference. We're now, if this all works, going to go on to the Salmon Thames Rivers project, because His Majesty was quite rightly mentioned the need to conserve the environment for future generations. So who better to start off this conference than 3 representatives from the Salmon School Thames Rivers project? And I would like to introduce Konstantinos. Would you like to come up? Nada, would you like to come up? And Emily, who are the representatives of 3 of the amazing schools that have been involved with the inspirational Anna Forbes. Anna, where have I lost you? Come on up, Anna, come on up. They want to tell you what salmon means to them and what their rivers mean to them. We need to listen. On you go, Constantine.
My name is Constantinus and I go to Review Primary School. As part of the Salmon School, we learnt about the environment, visited our river and made some salmon art. We also collected eDNA and found out that creatures live in our river.
My name is Neda, and I go to St. Margaret Clitheroe Primary School. I think that salmon are important because they help transport nutrients between the ocean and fresh or salty water environments, which help the ecosystem. They are also becoming endangered and are at risk of becoming extinct due to our selfish behaviors, such as littering, the construction of dams which block their waterways, and the polluting of our oceans and rivers.
My name is Emily and I go to John Rankin School. My message to you at this conference is that something needs to be done now to protect salmon and our wildlife. We need a good environment with lots of animals and plants to have a healthy, happy life. Please work hard to save salmon and the environment for us.
Thank you. Well, firstly, you've set a really high standard for the speakers that are coming, so thank you for that. You've also given this audience the challenge ahead of us, and we owe it to Constantinus, Nada, and Emily, and other children across the Atlantic and the Pacific that we hand over our rivers to them that are healthy and thriving with wild salmon. Let's make sure their generation and those that follow them don't just read about wild salmon in history books. And to help us on that journey, I'm going to introduce Fawn Sharp. Now, we've been hearing a lot about American presidents in the last few days and weeks, but I am really delighted to introduce one in person in the form of Fawn Sharp, the former president of the National Congress of American Indians. And just so you understand the scale of that role, she was serving 574 tribal nations across the US. No easy task. And that's to share, she's come over to share how indigenous tribes of the Pacific Northwest have lived with and have been sustained by wild salmon for thousands of years. And it's a perspective that we often lose in our Western culture. So Fawn, thank you for coming such a long way and for joining us on our panels throughout the conference.
I'm a little short. Yohach Anjak Haiwishka. That's hello. My name is Fawn in my traditional language of Quinault. First of all, I just want to say how delighted I am to be here. I've traveled the world quite extensively to tell my story, but the opportunity to come here to talk about specifically wild salmon has been a dream of mine for decades. As a young president of my own tribe back in I got elected in 2006. And it was at a time when I understood the impacts of climate change, but it was very difficult to have a conversation with anyone at that time. And I traveled to Poznan, Poland to COP14 to have my first substantive engagement on climate policy as a young official. So I don't take these conversations for granted. I understand the value and the strength of the brain trust in this room, from our youngest to our oldest to our most experienced. This is truly an honor and a blessing to be here, so thank you. I want to begin my remarks by just taking you back in time to my early childhood and the formative years to kind of give you a sense of the fight that we have as indigenous peoples in the United States. So in the 1950s and 60s, the policy of the United States was to terminate tribal nations. In fact, a number of tribes were terminated in that termination era. I was born May 1970. July 1970, President Nixon stood before the United States Congress to formally announce the end of the termination era and the beginning of the self-determination era. So I like to think I was born at the 11th hour, the 59th minute, the 59th second of the termination era, and I was called to serve a lifetime of advancing our inherent sovereign rights as tribal nations. Then as a young child, about 2, 3, 4, 5, during those years, I fished with my grandparents. We own a family fishing ground in the Upper Quinault, and I would get up at the crack of dawn, and I would help carry the gas tank to our boat, and we would make our way up the Quinault River. As we came around the bend, if we saw a sinking cork, that was exciting news because we knew there would be salmon in our fishing grounds. And so I spent a good part of my childhood with my grandparents fishing, understanding the relationship that we have with this incredible species. It's not just subsistence for our people, but they're part of our ceremonies. They're part of who we are, our identity as Quinault people. And at that time, my mother served as a recording secretary for the Northwest Indian Fish Commission. And you have to understand, at that time, we were involved in what was called fish wars. There was an active effort to terminate our treaties with the United States that secured our fishing rights. And so my mother would go around the Pacific Northwest to record these meetings. And so in the morning, I spent time on the river. In the afternoons and the evenings, I was in the middle of policy conversations. So you could imagine the impression that would have on a young child. At 8 years old, I understood the word treaty abrogation, and I aspired to become an attorney. Now, no one in my family had ever gone to college. The tuition at Gonzaga University, my school at that time, was $11,000, or excuse me, $10,000. Our family livelihood was $11,000. So just to go to college, it was an entire year's income for my family. Well, with a lot of help and a lot of support, I would go on to college, and my grandfather talked about a law degree as a social tool, a political tool, and an economic tool. So I set out to protect our livelihood, to advocate for tribal rights and tribal interests. High school 15, by the I was recruited by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and I would go on to spend 4 years out in law and justice. I finally returned back to law school after taking a couple of years hiatus, and I would then spend the next decade serving as an attorney general for my nation. I came back home after 10 years I moved 17 times. In fact, I attended Oxford University here to study international human rights law. And at that time, I just knew I was set out to serve my community and my people. And after a decade, our president announced her retirement, and some tribal elders talked to me about running for political office, and I told them, you have to be crazy. I've been trained to seek truth, justice, fairness, politics, tribal politics. And an elder pulled me aside and said, Fawn, you're not running to be a politician. You're running to be a leader, and a leader brings those virtues to office. So with that in mind, and honoring the calling of our ancestors and our elders, I ran for political office. I won the presidency in 2006, 2009, 12, 15, 18, 21. And so I spent 6 terms, 18 years as an elected official for my nation. I also in that time served as president of the regional tribal organization, the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, and that's 72 tribes in a 6-state region, and then ultimately president of the National Congress of American Indians, which is 574 tribes from Alaska to California to Florida to Maine. I got elected in October of 19. A global pandemic hit January 20, so I would spend the next 4 years leading all of Indian country through a global pandemic. And at that time, I realized we are facing multiple apocalyptic challenges. Not only are we facing a global pandemic, we're facing the climate crisis, and we're facing a burning political landscape of opposition and division inside the United States. So it's quite an extraordinary way to capstone my political career. Now that's just a little sort of screenshot of my life over the last half a century. A young child growing up in the fishing wars, going off to college, and then serving 3 decades, my citizens and our people, for advocating for climate change and leadership. Now, I want to just briefly explain why at this point in life I've decided to leave public service and go into the private sector. My last day of being a president for my nation was in April of this year. And it occurred to me that the scale of the climate crisis and the scale of the challenges facing our salmon are far beyond anything that any public government can do alone. Inside the United States, as epic as the Inflation Reduction Act was to provide funding and resources to tribal nations, it was $500 million. You divide that among 574 tribes, it's less than $1 million. And we all know that the public treasury is simply funding the symptoms of climate change, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the mega fires, and we're reliant on philanthropy to help backfill that. Well, I see on the horizon a move to monetize nature, and there's a new economy on the horizon that seeks to value nature. Now, I want to provide a couple data points where I think we're on a trajectory that is entirely at odds with Indigenous peoples. Last year, the World Economic Forum issued a report that 5% of the population governs 80% of the biodiversity that's left. That's Indigenous peoples. If you look at our lands and territories from a satellite photo on the Pacific Northwest, you'll see almost a perfectly green triangle where my nation lives. Our forests, our rivers, you could go from glacier to ocean and see no development. And we've maintained that since time immemorial. So I like to flip that data point to say we're outperforming everyone else by 400%. With little to no resources. Imagine what Indigenous peoples could do if we were fully resourced. That's the point we're at right now, and our ancestors long foretold of a day of reckoning when the world simply is on a trajectory that's not sustainable. We are in that moment, and we are facing apocalyptic challenges. But if we were to look at nature through the lens of Indigenous peoples, if we were to see the intangible, priceless value of nature, then the world stands a chance to value our life and value nature, not simply as a commodity, but as something that's absolutely vital to the very breath and life that we live and breathe day in, day out. And so when you look at the fact that Indigenous peoples are governing these precious lands and valuing nature in a way, we have an opportunity on the front end not only to value nature through an Indigenous lens, but as the world is seeking solutions, and as shareholders are suing boards and corporations for not managing investment against climate risk, we have not only financial and performance metrics, but metrics that reflect Indigenous values, Indigenous pricing, Indigenous just knowledge and the ancient wisdom that goes back centuries for how we manage our landscape. And so while the world might think Indigenous peoples are weak and vulnerable, we're on the front lines, we're disproportionately impacted, and we have little to no resources, we are strong, we are resilient. To the contrary. And I would like to suggest here to this audience that just like the Indigenous peoples carry centuries of knowledge and wisdom, and we carry centuries of resilience in our DNA, so too do the salmon. The salmon may seem to be weak and vulnerable and threatened, but they carry DNA that's timeless. They carry DNA that's strong and resilient. And you see it in the United States when we take down dams. Salmon return almost immediately to that point. We know where we come from as Indigenous peoples. The salmon know where they come from as native. And so while some of the most powerful countries on the planet have sought to terminate Indigenous peoples, and while vast development has sought to inflict environmental genocide upon our landscape and upon our natural resources. There is so much strength and resilience. And so over the next 3 days, I think it's going to be critically important to really understand that timeless value and that knowledge that transcends generations. And I would call upon people that there's so much conflict in today's, in today's society. There's a place for all of us to rise above the burning political landscape, to rise above conflict and opposition, to rise above apathy, to join that place, a place like this, where we can have these conversations, where we can invoke the strength and power of our ancestors and ultimately our Almighty Creator, because there is a perfect plan and a perfect time for all of us to come together. So again, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for the opportunity to set the stage for this very important conversation and bring the life and stories of our ancestors. My mentor, Billy Frank Jr., said the salmon cannot get out of the river to defend themselves. The salmon cannot get out of the rivers to advocate for their interests and their survival. But that is our sacred responsibility and duty. And I thank each and every one of you for picking up that mantle and carrying that advocacy forward so that our salmon live forever. Siakwil, thank you.
Marvellous. Somebody's walked off with my notes, so this is going to be fun. I think those are them, Andrew. It was me. Right, Fawn, thank you. You've helped carry on that high standard, and I know you're going to be joining us on panels throughout the 3 days. But I'd also encourage you all to go and have a conversation with Fawn. I did it yesterday afternoon. I was blown away, so I'd urge you all to do that. I would now like to introduce our next keynote speaker for the day, Professor Sudita Helm. Sudita's Professor of Economic Policy at the University of Oxford, and from 2012 to 2020 was the independent chair of the Natural Capital Committee, meaning that he was the person providing the advice to governments in 3 key areas: energy and climate, regulation, utilities and infrastructure, natural capital and the environment, all of which are highly relevant to this conference. He's still providing that much-needed advice to governments and the wider world to address the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss and how that impacts the nation's wealth, however you measure it. Sudita, the floor's yours.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to this incredibly important occasion for so many people who care so much about vital aspects of our natural environment. The task is to channel that care, that almost indignation which many of us feel for the damage that's being done, into ways that can concretely make a difference. And it was great to be here and start off with those few words from the children at the beginning, because this is generational. I don't want to be the last generation to cast a fly over a salmon pool, though I don't think the salmon are greatly at risk from my exercise in this area. And I don't want to be part of passing on to the next generation a set of assets, natural assets in particular, which are worse than my generation inherited. But that's what we're doing. And we don't have to do that. We don't need to do that. And indeed, we're going to do an enormous amount of damage to the prospects of the next generation if we carry on in what I regard as an economically destructive way of taking our economies forward. So it's generational. It's generational to me, it's personal, but it's generational in a much more important sense. Now, the way I want to frame this is to put salmon in a context of natural capital and a context of ecosystems. Nobody's going to solve the problems of salmon in isolation. They have to be solved in a systemic way. And they have to be solved not just as an economic asset that can be depreciated, but as assets in perpetuity. And the framework to think about this is to start from what is essentially an ethical judgment. And there has to be an ethical judgment to motivate what one does, which is that we should not leave the next generation with a set of assets that are less good than we inherited. And the assets that really matter are the natural assets, but our energy systems, our water systems, our communication systems, and our transport systems are part and parcel of that frame. And when we say we must not leave the next generation worse off than we are in this regard, what we're saying is that what's special about these assets is they're assets in perpetuity. They're going to be there and should continue to be there for practically ever. And that statement has with it an obvious and actually quite radical implication, which is there can be no depreciation. There can be no conventional accounting for these assets. It's our duty to do the capital maintenance, to fix the tiles when they fall off the roof, so that those assets do not decline, do not depreciate. And that means that we have to pay. We have to pay the cost of maintaining these assets as previous generations did and future generations should do in the future. You don't borrow to fix the tile on your roof. You pay it out of your current income. And part of the ways in which we're living way beyond our environmental means is we say, I tell you what, okay, we'll fix up these environments. How are we going to do it? Well, it's our duty to fix them up, but I tell you what, we'll borrow from you in the future so you can pay for the assets which we had the duty to maintain through time. This is really important because it affects how you think about national income accounting too. When the Chancellor stands up and makes a budget, hopefully not quite like the last one, they set out what they think we can spend by, quote, balancing the current budget. But you know what they do? They take as much as what I call capital maintenance, call it investment, and say, oh, it's borrowing, so we're creating assets so we can borrow against that. That's how you get to debt as 100% of GDP. And you keep borrowing off the future, you keep passing down less and less, more and more debt, and less maintenance. So this is a really important framework to think about these things, and yes, accounting is actually quite important. It's not just a tedious activity to fill in the tax returns. I'm sure lots of people are trying to do that in the few days left of January. So looking through the natural capital lens and identifying ecosystems as absolutely crucial to this framework, we typically need to distinguish between two types of natural capital. There's the stuff that gets used once. Natural capital is what nature gives us for free. It costs us to work out how to get benefits from it, but it's given to us for free. It's our endowment. Now, some of this stuff gets used once. Minerals are exactly of that form. Iron ore, oil, gas, coal, a whole variety of them. You could reuse them, but practically they get used once. And the whole of the 20th century is built on minerals, non-renewable natural capital. There would be no 8 billion people on this planet, but for the depletion of non-renewable natural capital. And it's our obligation, when we use it so that future generations don't have the opportunity to use it, that we compensate them for what we've depleted. That's why the Norwegians have a sovereign wealth fund. They set aside some of the returns that come from using non-natural capital and bequeath that in a sovereign wealth fund to the next generation. Well, take a look in the North Sea. My generation had a party. We spent the whole damn lot. Nothing left for future generations, or very little. Perhaps a few assets that financial institutions own elsewhere. That's not the way to run non-renewable natural capital. And if you want to see how badly that's being done at the moment, have a look on Google Earth to the cobalt mines in Congo. Those cobalt mines that are producing the cobalt to go in your car, your electric car, which is supposed to be net zero. Have a look. Look at the lithium, sorry, apologies, that great nation. Lithium, and the nickel and the copper. We carry on a massive scale, taking this back. But that's not what concerns us today. What concerns us is renewable natural capital. Renewable natural capital is the stuff that nature gives us for free and keeps on giving us for free forever, provided we don't over-deplete it. And a salmon stock is the obvious way to think about renewable natural capital, provided we look after its environment, provided we do the right things, then the next generation will have salmon and the generation after it. And indeed, as was stated at the outset, it should be in a state where there's so much of it that people get fed up of eating it. That would be a fine thing. So what we need to do when it comes to renewable natural capital is define the threshold below which it can never reproduce itself, except if you want to find some tech company to reinvent the woolly mammoth. Good luck with that, but there might be some technical solution way into the future. But that it cannot reproduce itself anymore, and then you not only lose it for us, it's not just you and me that go and have a look at the pool at the bottom of a fast bit of river and can't see any salmon where we used to see salmon. It's that everybody in the future, every single generation in the future, will not have that either. That's what taking something below a threshold means. And that value is not just in the value of the salmon now. It's almost infinite. It's right out there into the future. It's every single generation that's getting those benefits into the future. Now, we don't know where that threshold is precisely, and never believe someone if they tell you. So we need to have safe limits. We need to make sure the populations are above, well above the thresholds, and then we can have the benefits of those salmon in the future, just like people can have the benefits of the herring in the future if they don't overfish them down to that level. It's a pretty obvious rule, it's pretty straightforward, and it tells you that trying to put a price on this is pointless. A, we want to have it forever anyway, and B, that price would have to include the value for all future generations. What we need to do is shortcut and say, no, what we have to do is protect that asset, do the capital maintenance to make sure its environment is in good shape, because we're never going to, hopefully, sell it. It has no asset value in a market, and that open-endedness is there into the future. So that's why natural capital is an important way of thinking about this, and that's why it leads to a very different set of economic considerations from the conventional ones of, well, it's just another asset, buy it and sell it. You know what, I've got an iPhone, so who cares, I haven't got any swallows left, or salmon left, etc. These are not substitutable. These are part of what makes an economy work. Now, the next bit is about the units. Okay? What should we be the focus of the attempts to, in this case, save the Atlantic salmon or save the other salmon species around the world? Now, the answer to this is that there is no perfect unit, because ultimately it's the whole world, because everything's connected to everything that's connected to everything else. Okay? But in practice, and you have to be pragmatic about this, the obvious place to go is to a catchment. And especially in a country like the UK, our landscape divides itself up into catchments. Not perfectly. It's a bit more difficult when you get to East Anglia to work out where you want to draw the lines. But we know what the, well, it's so flat, you just keep going. What the Thames catchment looks like. We know what the Severn catchment looks like. We know what that huge catchment of the Tay looks like. And we know what tiny little catchments in the Outer Hebrides look like. These units are integrated units. Everything that happens in the catchment depends upon everything else. And unless that catchment is thriving, you can forget about the salmon. Unless the Thames is thriving, you won't have enough salmon for people to get bored with eating wild salmon coming up the Thames. If you live up one of the tributaries of the Thames like I do, you can go and stand by the local sewage works for about 1,000 hours a year and watch the shit going into the river. That mucks up not just our village, where it floods onto the village green on a regular occasion, but it mucks up the entirety of the Thames down to here. That's the connectivity of a catchment. So, give me the pragmatism of, I'm going to divide the country up into catchments. I'm going to focus the efforts on individual catchments. That then leads to, well, how do you do it? Well, there are two things to bear in mind here. The first one is that it's no one party that owns the catchment, controls the catchment. There are multiple people involved in a catchment and in a catchment system. And if you don't include them in the game, you're not going to make a lot of progress, and what progress you're going to make is going to be very expensive. What is the point of drawing up water plans if the farmers aren't included? How exactly does that work? What you end up with is very high bills, loads of concrete tanks being sunk around the landscape to absorb fast runoff, which shouldn't have run off fast in the first place because the land should have been managed differently. If you're going to have more trees, more woodland, etc., maybe for carbon reasons, then where should you put them? Well, they'll affect greatly the whole nature of the catchment relationships. You know all this stuff much better than I do, I'm sure. So the parties are multiple, but the second thing which is new is that we can, in extreme detail, digitally map everything that's in a catchment. So you can take a satellite and you can go and have a look down to a resolution of, I don't know what it is, it's not my area, but about 20 square meters, and see what's on it and what's going on. This is a fantastic advance. This is no longer, we'll send out an environment organisation person to go and have a look and fill in a notebook and write it down and hand it back into the office. This isn't also a need for large numbers of regulators to go round doing their job. I recall a while back, a previous head of the Environment Agency was asked by a select committee why they weren't more regularly inspecting farms. And I think, if I recall correctly, the answer given was, well, it would take about 200 years to visit every single farm in this was England and Wales, I think, or just England. Well, probably take you a morning to do it digitally. And you can see a hell of a lot more from a satellite than you can walking around because you're limited to the areas you can go. So we now can see in amazing detail, in real time, all the time, exactly what's happening in a catchment. So this is fantastically helpful. And not just to make sure people do what they're supposed to do and make sure that pollution is limited and that people are prosecuted for letting slurry or whatever it is go into a river. Maybe water companies for releasing sewage on a sort of fairly permanent basis. But we can do that, we can police them better, and that's an advantage. But what's really advantageous is when you gather together all the parties' interests in a catchment and you say, What's the most efficient way? What's the cheapest way of improving the quality of that catchment now? Okay. And all sorts of interested parties will have their pet schemes. Some people will say, you know what, we should put some more physical infrastructure in to stop the flooding. Other people will say, you need a natural capital solution to absorb floodwater, etc., and reduce silt. Yet more people will say, tell you what, if we planted trees, particularly deciduous trees along the riverbanks, this would reduce the temperature and have certain effects. Well, what you can do with digital mapping is simply say, okay, great idea. You come forward with all the ideas you want to come forward to. Now, what we'll do is we'll take the digital map of the catchment and we'll simulate the change you want. And we'll compare simulating the change you want to make with the change somebody else proposes. And we'll come up with a catchment plan, which isn't just, this is the things we'd like to happen, but it's a sequence and order which we can bring to how to rationally and pragmatically go through the things that need to happen to improve the outcomes of the catchment. And what's more, we can measure those effects much better than we previously have done. We can measure what's in the river, we can measure what pollutants are there, we can measure to a quite important degree how much carbon's being saved and sequestrated in different places. We can look in very great detail at measuring what happens when people plant maize and leave the land fallow in the winter and watch the soil come off. I can go down to my local even load when it's been heavy rain and I can watch the brown soil going straight into the river. I'm sure it would anger anyone else. It certainly angers me. But if I go and say, you know what, they should stop this runoff of there, right? Yeah, that's an important point to make. But if I can measure precisely and demonstrate exactly what was happening and what the consequences were, how much more powerful that is. So taking this digital approach, what I suggest is that the core of protecting salmon inside the UK, offshore, etc., lots of other things, is to have serious catchment plans digitally mapped of all the catchments in Britain with a sequence of steps that need to be taken to hold the salmon to the threshold and build the safe limits back into the population. Of course, you can't do it all immediately, although actually the technology is now pretty cheap. But you can do some. And people can take their catchment and they can have on a website their digital map and they can play with it. It's a fantastically open way of doing it. I want to, as a side, get rid of Ofwat and do the regulation of the water companies in exactly this kind of way. Okay? So you do have to have a catchment plan, and then you have to have money. And money needs justification. And justification comes, first of all, from what's necessary to stop further deterioration. Stop not doing the capital maintenance. Fix the potholes in the road as a minimum. And money comes because this is a serious basis of a sustainable economy going forward. Now, we have ways in which people can be persuaded to pay for this in bilateral ways, things like carbon offsets and biodiversity offsets. Quite a lot of these are greenwash. Quite a lot of them are like buying indulgences. But nevertheless, there are monetary flows. It's a bit like the landfill levies providing money for the Wildlife Trust, of which I'm a vice president. Would we rather the landfill wasn't there? Yeah. Did we take the money? Yeah. Of course we did. It's the only way of getting cash to do things that need to be done. But it's beholden to make sure one can demonstrate that what the money's spent on will actually be the best things to improve the state of those catchments going forward. So it might sound an odd thing to say, although economists are known for this kind of thing. It's really important not to waste it, to make every pound count in terms of improvement. The litmus test is, how is that catchment better because I did this, And why is it better because I did this in a way that exceeds what would have happened if I did that? That's about ranking and rationality. So I think that's part of the frame of taking this forward. Is it doable? Of course it's doable. Of course this terrible situation we find ourselves in is reversible. Much of this stuff isn't actually either rocket science or big sums of money. Quite a lot of it is small scale. We spend an enormous amount on catchments already, very badly. I once, many years ago, was chairman of something called the Academic Panel of what was the predecessor of DEFRA, and probably about 15 or 20 ministers since over that period since then. And I got them to put a map of the Thames up on the wall. And I said, now let's go through all the spending that takes place in the Thames. Right? From the flood defences to the water company bills to the riverside management, etc. And I said, right, well, how much do you think that lot comes to? And there was a lot of uncertainty. Didn't even know, right? But I said, whatever the number is, anyone in this room tell me if you can spend that money worse than we're currently spending it. Could anyone think of getting less for the money than we currently get? Well, next time you pay your water bill, think about that. Could we possibly do it worse? As an aside, it may or may not be the right answer, do we really need a canal round Oxford for, what, 200 million to reduce the flooding of Botley on the west of Oxford, when we could have spent a fraction of that money upstream, managing the water meadows, flooding some of the farmland, etc. Nobody even asked, right, that question. That's what the catchment modelling enables you to do, to ask the questions, and you'll be surprised at how many benefits come from it. So I think this is doable, it's practical, it's applied, it requires young people especially, who've got the digital and technical skills and AI to do this. These are all opportunities to help us do what we want to do. But it is at the last minute, because if there's any complacency in this audience, there certainly isn't, but more widespreadly in the population there is. Last year, parts per million went to 424 of carbon in the atmosphere. +2 every single year since 1990 without a single blip. Actually, last year was +3. No impact, no dent has been made into the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere over the last 35 years from the baseline. And when we turn to biodiversity, look how sad the salmon stocks are as indicator species. And then ask yourself, are you surprised that the puffins and the guillemots, all those wonderful birds, are also going down at the same time? It's not rocket science what's going on, but it's going on, and it's going on at speed. And therefore, this is very much the last moment, but this is solvable, and we have the technologies to do it, and we should do it, and we should do it so that at least metaphorically, we can all look those 3 children in the eyes and say, we did give you at least as good assets as we inherited. And should they be minded, they would not be constrained by the fact that there are no salmon to even try fishing if they wanted to take that up. Thank you very much.
We really are maintaining that high standard set by the 3 children this morning and bringing it round. So thank you, Sadita. That was inspirational. And you will be on a panel later for some questions and further discussion. My last task this morning is to introduce the conference's professional facilitator, you'll be delighted to hear, Ella McSweeney. Who better to guide you through the next couple of days than a renowned investigative and broadcast journalist. We hit gold here, with scientific background in zoology, a deep understanding of food, farming, and biodiversity. Ella, thank you for giving up your time and guiding us through this conference, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled and honoured to be here and have the opportunity to hear from all of you and what is going to be such an invigorating, stimulating and inspiring few days. As you can hear from my accent, I come from Ireland, and I don't need to tell any of you what's going on with the salmon and our habitats over there. They are missing from some of our previously most salmon-rich and beautiful rivers up and down the country. And as we have heard so much, time is rapidly running out. There is not one wild salmon in Ireland to spare, but there is an awful lot of hope, and I'm very interested in what Sudita just spoke about. We in Ireland have a very catchment-based and catchment-focused policy in terms of managing and trying to rehabilitate our rivers and our habitats. And there is a lot of positive work going on at local level, and I think of it almost like little tiny chinks of light in what is and can be a very dark room. And as we've heard, focusing on wild salmon makes so much sense. What is good for them is good for the health of habitats up and down our countries. So here's hoping that all of us can bring a little bit more light to the overall aim, which is to bring back the salmon. In the end, we need to hear stories of what works and to urgently go and do more of that. And I really look forward to hearing those stories from all of you. As you can see, today is divided up into different sessions, so we'll get started. There are a few much needed coffee breaks, tea breaks and lunch breaks in between, but the idea is to have as much engagement from all of you as possible. So please, I'm quite old-fashioned, you can wave at me and we'll bring a mic for comments and questions, but we also have Slido, so please use it and get your questions in and your comments in, and I will put as many of them to our incredible guests. But we start with session 1. Wild salmon in crisis. So we're going to have to take a deep breath and hear the difficulty, the science and the data behind the current situation, and to give a kind of context as to why we are all here in the first place. We know that the story is one of disappearance of salmon slipping away before our eyes, but because they rely on the health of our freshwaters and our marine environments, they are, of course, a barometer for the health of our planet, a key bellwether of global climate change as well. So we're going to get a sense of the state of salmon in the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. I'm really looking forward to this session now. So I'm really delighted to introduce our first guest, Dr. Katrina Connors. The Pacific Salmon Foundation published a report a few months ago giving us the clearest picture yet of how Pacific salmon are faring in Canada. And in short, well, we know and we can guess what the answer is. They're being pushed to the brink by a whole range of pressures, and that is even before we talk about climate change. So to tell us more, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Connors from the Pacific Salmon Foundation. She spent over 2 decades working on salmon science and conservation, including leading the development of the first ever online data visualization tool for the Pacific salmon called the Pacific Salmon Explorer. She is a Canadian commissioner to the Pacific Salmon Commission, and she's also a doctorate in salmon socio-ecological systems, so who better to hear from? So please put your hands together for Dr. Katrina Connors.
Good morning. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from the west coast of Canada, and perhaps not starting with the most uplifting messaging for this morning, but I have faith that over the next few days that things will get better and we'll leave here feeling inspired. So today I'm going to be speaking about the state of Pacific salmon in Canada and hopefully set some context for the conversations to come over the next few days. So before I jump into talking about the state of Pacific salmon in Canada, I wanted to give some broader context to the state of Pacific salmon across the North Pacific Rim. So here you can see a map of the North Pacific Rim, and the areas in brown are showing the spawning distributions of salmon. And you can see that they're quite widely distributed, ranging from the southern parts in Japan all the way up through Russia, through Alaska, down, this is Canada here, for those of you that are less familiar, and then down all the way through the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and all the way as far south as California. And across these various watersheds, there's 7 species of Pacific salmon, and each of these species are comprised of thousands of unique salmon populations, and each of them have unique life histories that vary in terms of when and where they go to sea, when they come back to spawn, and how they use the different habitats that they interact with. And as we've heard before, diversity is really what underpins the resilience of salmon to adapt to an ever-changing climate, and really what we need to hold on to if we're to have salmon for the future. So this might be a bit surprising to look at this figure. So this is showing the total returns, so catch plus the number of spawners to watersheds across the North Pacific Rim for 3 species of Pacific salmon that are the most abundant. And so this includes pink chum and sockeye. And you might be surprised to hear that there's actually more Pacific salmon in the Pacific Ocean than at any other time over the past 100 years. And so here we're looking at returns to all of these watersheds, and you can see that there's almost 6 billion salmon returning in recent years, which is really just an astounding amount. That's almost 4 times as much as there were just in the 60s and 70s. But it's not all the same everywhere, so there's a lot of variability. So this is looking at the North Pacific Rim as well, and you can see that there's a lot of variability across regions. So what we're looking at here is changes in the catch from salmon fisheries between the most recent 5 years that we have with data, so 2017 to 2021, compared to the decade prior. And you can see for the most part, fisheries catch, salmon catch is declining throughout their range. And in particular at southern latitudes in places like Japan and North and South Korea, southern parts of Russia, and then Southeast Alaska through Canada, you see that catch is declining. But it's certainly not the same case everywhere. And you start to see a bit of a different story at northern latitudes. So in places like Russia, Kamchatka Peninsula, and places around the Western Bering Sea, you see that actually catch in some places is at record highs. For example, in Russia, you see that catches are 250% that average. And so really you see a lot of variability across this region, and you see that climate change is really shifting the distribution of salmon to northern parts of their range. So let's take a little bit of a closer look in terms of Pacific salmon in Canada. And so for our assessments, we've looked at 9 spatial units, so they're regions, which really represent the major salmon-bearing watersheds that salmon utilize. And as you alluded to in the beginning, the Pacific Salmon Foundation has recently produced a report looking at the state of Pacific salmon in Canada. And this is really a detailed, systematic dive looking at the different species of salmon in each of these regions. And what we found is that declines in abundance for all species in all regions are widespread. And this is a figure that's from our State of Salmon report. And essentially what we found is that more than 70% of the different species in the 9 different regions we looked at were below their long-term average. And just to give you a sense of what we're looking for, so in Canada, there's 6 species of Pacific salmon that we looked at, shown as the columns here. And then each of these fish is a unique species in a given region. And what we did is compared the current spawner abundance, so the numbers making it back to their streams, to the long-term average spawner abundance for that given species and region. And what we did is we looked at the deviation and how much they were between their current spawner abundance and that long-term average, with ranging from 150% above that historical average to 100%. And what you can start to see is that there's a whole lot of fish here in the red zone, really indicating the vast majority of salmon species in the various regions are below their long-term average abundance. And what you can also see is that chum and steelhead are below average in every single region we assessed. And chum in particular are up to 89% their long-term average. And for those of you that aren't as familiar with chum salmon, they're actually some of the longest-lived species of salmon in the Pacific coast. They're actually the 2nd largest species of salmon, second only to Chinook. And historically, they were the mainstay of commercial salmon fisheries in Canada. And in recent years, those fisheries have been all but decimated. And this really mirrors a pattern of decline that's not just happening in Canada, but across the North Pacific Rim as well. Steelhead are also not faring very well. They're up to 82% below their long-term average. And some of you might know that steelhead are heteroparous like Atlantic salmon, which means that they can spawn multiple times. And in many places throughout Canada, many salmon populations are at risk of extinction, with 2 populations listed as endangered. And in some systems, only a handful of wild spawners are returning. One other finding that was a bit surprising to us is that the northern regions in Canada are actually experiencing the most widespread declines. And this is a bit surprising. You tend to think of these northern regions as being resistant to climate change, being cooler, but that's really not the case that we're seeing. And in fact, these northern regions in Canada are warming faster than other parts of the country. If you take a quick look at our northernmost region, the Yukon Territory, we start to see kind of a similar trend. The 3 species of salmon that spawn there, 2 of them are well below their long-term average. And there's concerns that the rapid and accelerating pace of climate change in these northern regions, combined with the poor state of salmon, really are going to pose challenges for the recovery. But we want to have some hope and leave you with a sense of optimism. And we are seeing some signs of recovery, which really just speaks to the resilience of salmon and the opportunity that salmon can rebound from periods of low abundance if we give them a chance. And just to give a bit of an example of that, we're going to look at the Fraser watershed, which is Canada's largest salmon-bearing region, and looking at Fraser coho. So coho salmon were highly abundant in the early 80s, early 90s. Then about the mid-1990s, they began to crash. Their population declined by over 60%. And there are some pretty radical measures brought into place. The fisheries minister at the time imposed a complete ban on any directed fisheries, and then declared what's now known as the coho crisis. Since then, there's been a major effort invested in their recovery, and that's been sustained through time. And this has included ongoing reductions in harvest, habitat recovery measures, and rebuilding strategies still in place. And what we start to see is that some of these efforts might just be paying off. We're starting to see current abundance going above average for the first time in decades. So this really leads us to questions around, given the poor state of salmon, what are some of the factors that are really contributing to their decline? We've heard a little bit about this morning. None of these things, I'm sure, are new to folks in this room. But just to give a little bit of a nod to them, salmon using a combination of freshwater and marine habitats are really exposed to a multitude of factors. And some of these are human disturbances, things that we do, things that we've talked about, everything from industrial and urban development in their spawning and freshwater habitats, overexploitation through fisheries, open net pen aquaculture. But then there's also things that happen naturally, forest fires and landslides. And probably the biggest factor that we've all recognized already this morning is climate change, which really just serves to compound all of these human and natural disturbances. So what does it look like in terms of the path forward? So just to sum up this state of salmon, really what we're seeing at the North Pacific scale is that there's more salmon than at any time over the past 100 years. But the distribution of salmon is really shifting in response to climate change. You're seeing some areas like the Russian Far East and the Western Bering Sea having record high catches, but then you have the opposite story at southern latitudes, including in Canada, where you have spawner abundance at all-time lows across most species and regions, and you have declining catches and fisheries. But there is hope, and the example that I shared of Fraser coho is really giving us a nod to what can happen if we give opportunities to populations to rebuild. And to really reinforce the messaging that's already been said today is that salmon are diverse, and if our strategies are focused around protecting the biodiversity, the life histories, and the biocomplexity that we have within the salmon populations, as well as the watersheds that they're part of, that's going to be our best path moving forward. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you, and I'll also call attention here if anyone's I preempted myself. If anyone's interested in checking out the results of our State of Salmon report in a bit more detail than what I glossed over here, the URL is at the bottom, stateofsalmon.ca. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Connors. We'll have a chance to put some questions to her after our next speaker. So please, if you do have comments or questions about that, and perhaps we can look a little bit more about the Fraser watershed and what was done there to make that recovery happen, we can explore that. I'm happy now to zoom over to the Atlantic, hear what's going on there, and introduce Dr. Alan Walker, the Principal Advisor for Cefas, giving governmental and agency scientific advice on the conservation of freshwater and diadromous fish. He grew up in the Highlands of Scotland, where he fished for trout, salmon, and sea trout. He went to study zoology when he was younger, completing a doctorate on sea trout physiology, and then did a postdoc on sea lice genetics. He's going to talk now a little bit about the state of wild salmon populations in the Atlantic. Dr. Walker.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm looking at the back just now. I'm just testing. Is this microphone working? Yeah, it's working good. I'm going to start with some cold, clean water, and I haven't been paid to say that. Okay, so my task that I've been set today is to connect you with wild Atlantic salmon. I'm going to do that through considering where are the salmon today, to make you think about them, how many there are, how many there have been in the past, pose some challenges and some lessons about the spatial scales of status and management, briefly consider pressures, and then I've been asked to end with some signs of hope. So just to give you the context of my talk, just to start with, I know almost all of you will know all about salmon already, but just briefly, they have a complex life cycle. They're born in fresh water. They grow, do most of their growing in the marine environment, and then they return home, most often literally home, to spawn. I'm going to present to you today on the status of salmon in the marine, and so in that adult phase. Obviously, you could measure it in different ways. So where are the adult salmon today? As you sit there, the Atlantic salmon adults are about as far away from their homes as they can get. So think about that. Obviously, the people who've traveled a long way, you can really associate with that today. But that's where the salmon are, out on the high seas in the North Atlantic, off Greenland, Iceland, up in the Norwegian seas. So they're as far away from home as they can get. How many are there? Well, it's a really difficult question to answer. How many do you see? Now, don't worry, I'm not going to talk to you about the methods that we use to try and estimate the number of salmon. But if you want to know more about it, you can come and speak to me or others later on. But in essence, to tell you, there are about 3 million adult salmon out there today in the North Atlantic. Now, 3 million sounds like an awful big number. Certainly would if it was in pounds. But you've got to remember that those 3 million salmon come from over 2,000 rivers across the North Atlantic, from North America all the way through Greenland. Yes, there's a salmon river in Greenland, across Iceland, to Norway and the Russian Federation, and down through Western Europe to Portugal. Those rivers, the salmon stocks in them, some of them count as thousands of salmon. Others are only a few tens. And then some of those rivers don't have any salmon anymore. So that 3 million is spread out across all of this, across the Atlantic. Still sounds like a big number. But in the 1970s, it was about 9 million. So there's been about a 70% decline in 50 years, which coincidentally is the lifetimes of Fawn and myself. But that's a dramatic decline. It's a big number. What does it mean? But just, I want to pause there and then think about the numbers and how you use them and how you appreciate them. So, on your left-hand side up here, the big red circle is showing you that the decline of all the salmon put together over the last 50 years is about a third of what there used to be. But if you consider that, you remember the 2,000 rivers and the different regions, if you look at that at a regional scale, and it's an international regional scale, and this is the typical scale that ICES and NASCO use to form their advice for international fisheries. And this is the panels in the middle here. We've got North America, Northern Europe, and Southern Europe there. And they're different sizes. Some of the methods and some of the metrics are different between these regions. But I think the pictures give you the story, and that's what I want you to focus on, is the pictures. We heard about the safe limits this morning, and these are the indicators of safe limits assessments. So red is below safe limit. In this middle panel, yellow is around about safe, and blue is above. I went for blue rather than green for what you probably imagine are the obvious reasons. But you can see there that in North America, there's 6 international, international regions, 6 large regions within the North America. 4 of them are currently below the safe limits. 2 of them are above. And then when you consider the European, so we've got the northern part of the European range and the southern part. And remember, the southern part stops at Portugal, so it's not like southern Europe, it's the southern part of the salmon range. Here we've got one group is, one group is above the safe limit, 2 groups are around about, and then 1 group is below the safe limit. So you see there's a lot of red. Then when you think about the individual rivers, which is where Sir Dieter was getting to this morning, over on the far side here, these panels, each of these dots corresponds to a river that was assessed in 2023. And not all salmon rivers are assessed in every year, which is why there's not 2,000 dots there. And here, it's slightly simplified the color scheme, but basically blue is above limit, red is below limit. And so you can see for North America, Northern Europe, and Southern Europe. And you can see a lot of red there, particularly in North America and in Southern Europe. So those are the state of the salmon at different spatial scales. And obviously, depending on the way that you manage and you address things, you want to be looking at these different scales. Now, why is that the case? Now, most of the talks going on from now are all going to be talking about the pressures, so I'm not going to talk about them in detail now, just give a nod to them. It's undoubtedly the case that there are fewer fish, fewer salmon, returning from the sea now than there were in the past. And the NASCO statistic that I think we heard in the video at the beginning of the day was that it takes about twice as many eggs now to produce an adult salmon as it did back in the 70s. Salmon face a variety, a diversity of pressures throughout their life. And the NASCO State of Salmon report from 2019 listed these pressure types. And so the risks, the threats are associated with climate change, diseases and parasites, stocking, invasive species, habitat degradation, predators, migration barriers, pollution, overexploitation, and aquaculture. And we'll hear more about many of these as we go on. But now I just want to bring you back and to make you think of being a salmon, just for a minute. And to think about all these pressures. And I want to make the point that we can think of all these pressures individually, but actually we have to think of them as a package over the life. And as you sit there now, The two of the most direct events that brought you to sit here this morning were probably what you had for breakfast, whether it was a continental or a full cooked, and how you got here. Did you walk? Did you take a taxi? Did you take a bus? So if somebody said, why is that person there? You said, well, it's what they had for breakfast, and it's how they got here. But actually, you sitting here now is probably a consequence of decisions and opportunities that happened at university, at college, at high school, going back even further than then to things that happened to you when you were in primary school. And actually, if you go back even further than then, it's probably a consequence of things that happened to your parents and decisions that they made. And the point I'm trying to make across here is that the pressures, the root cause of a pressure, the effect, might actually be, and if George forgives me, might be a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Now, maybe not a galaxy far, far away, but you get the point. So you've got to think about that. And we need to be thinking about that when we're thinking about the pressures and also the solutions. Don't just focus on the absolute here and now. Think of the big picture. There we go. So I've been asked to finish with some signs of hope, some signs of positivity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about things that are happening to reduce pressures on salmon and on their environments. Much you've heard before, but given it a slightly different perspective. If you think about fishing and fisheries, our fisheries are basically killing a far smaller proportion of the salmon stock now than they were in the past. In most cases, not in all cases, but in most cases. That, in many cases, is because fisheries have stopped, but in many more is particularly because of the introduction of the policy of catch and release. So the fish are caught, but then returned alive. So that's a way of reducing the pressure. In terms of restoring the salmon's habitat, we've got examples that we've heard of today already. We've got removing barriers that are stopping fish from getting to their habitats, so taking away dams altogether, or putting in fish passes, like this one here on my side here. This is a fish pass actually in Portugal. We've got restoring rivers to their natural flow rather than having them canalized in the middle. And we've also got, as we've heard, efforts to protect the water and the habitats from climate change. And was also touched on this morning already, we also have to remember that there's lots of initiatives that are going on to protect and restore the natural aquatic and terrestrial environments that will benefit salmon. And it's incumbent on us, and probably us in the room as much as anybody, to be looking at those and influencing those to protect salmon as well as their primary goals. And lastly, the last sign of positive hope, and I think we've touched on this today already as well, is the people. People are emotionally invested across the Atlantic and beyond in salmon as a species, or multiple species. Examples are NASCO, which brings together governments, agencies, NGOs, and the indigenous peoples who have salmon as the core of their cultural heritage. We had the International Year of the Salmon, and you'll hear more about that later, I think on Wednesday, which brought together like-minded, salmon-interested people from the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic, so across the whole of the Northern Hemisphere. And we have, most recently, we have the IUCN Red List reassessments, which are helping to raise the profile of salmon to us, but also to the wider community. So stealing some of the words from that International Year of the Salmon, we're helping to raise the profile of salmon within and beyond the Samosphere. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening, and thank you for connecting with wild salmon. Thank you.
You can take a seat over here. Thank you so much. Thank you. You can take a seat and get some more of that lovely cool water. I'd like to ask Professor Helm and Dr. Connors to please come up, and we're going to have a brief enough chat. We've got about 15 minutes, so please, if you have questions, start waving at me. I've got a few coming in through Slido. And thank you all for a very stimulating session. I have to say I slightly steeled myself and was thinking it was going to be a lot more negative than it was, because there's an awful lot there that I think we can work with. Katrina, talk to us a little bit about the Fraser watershed and what is the key understanding as to why that level seems to be coming up a tiny bit, not a huge amount, but a tiny bit.
Yeah, I mean, I wish it was that simple to describe, and I wish it's something that we could replicate quite easily. I think there's some things at play that we can't control. So marine survival, so the condition of the ocean has improved for coho. So that certainly contributed to the rebound that we're seeing. So that's something that's a bit harder to kind of work the levers. But I think on the flip side of that, and the things that we can control, is fishing. And so I did mention that. Fishing has really been scaled back for the past 2 decades, and that's made a huge amount of difference and has allowed the population to rebuild. There's also been pretty significant investments in habitat restoration, so they're freshwater habitats, protecting kind of freshwater refugia, and that's been something that's kind of unparalleled in terms of the investments that have been made. And I think all of these things in concert are leading to these early signs of recovery.
Do you anticipate that the recovery will continue or that it's going to plateau?
I think it can. I think some things we can't predict, like will marine survival remain high? You know, at times when they were, you know, slow at low abundance, marine survival is about 1%. You know, that's coming down from 10 to 15%, you know, decades prior. I think that's possible, but there's always the temptation to resume fisheries as soon as we start to see kind of early signs of rebuilding. And I think resilience is not just abundance, it's the diversity of habitats and populations. So it's kind of, you know, the diversity of actions, just not looking at declines in fisheries.
Alan, I just wonder, and I'm very mindful that there are anglers in the room, and fishing is a very culturally important activity, but is it time? I mean, I've spoken to scientists in Ireland who say it's absolutely time to say no more salmon. We're done. We'll put a hold in it for 5 years, 10 years, but we need to stop fishing salmon, full stop.
That's a really difficult question. It's a very emotive question. As you said, there's a lot of people here who fishing is an emotional thing, but it's also a cultural, and it's also a financial and economic thing as well. Yeah, that's a really difficult one to answer for me. I'd like, it would be an easy thing to do relative to lots of other things, and there will be stocks that probably need that. What's happening, particularly in these countries just now, is actually they're moving to 100% catch and release. So you can continue to have some fishing, but minimize the fishing-related impact. It's not removing the fishing-related impact, but it's minimizing it. And that's the step. That might be as far as they can go.
But I mean, what we've seen is a state of emergency, is it not?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let's ask the question in a different way. Scientifically, take away all the difficult stuff. Scientifically, what would happen if all fishing stopped for a period of 5 years with a review or something like that afterwards?
We'd have more salmon spawning, and we'd have a better chance of starting to tip that curve to recovering stocks. But I just pause and caveat that with, we've had fisheries close in the past, and people have said, oh, you know, we've lost this fisheries closed, so therefore everything will get better. And it doesn't. Or it hasn't done in many of those cases. So you have to remember that we're not working in a steady state at the moment. In many cases, we're still working with a decline. But if you don't take the fish out of the river, you've got more fish to spawn, you've got a better chance.
Dieter, I have a question here. I agree with Dieter that it isn't rocket science regarding what we need to do, but what is stopping that from happening? People have been trying to make change.
Oh, well, there are lots of interests in a catchment which end up doing a lot of damage. and there is a limited number of people who actually want to improve, for example, the salmon. So back to the question of, well, you know, I think about this when I go salmon fish, should I just stop? I'm not very good, so I probably make no great impact. But if you withdraw all that interest from the river, then other interests have got an open pitch. And if you look along major salmon rivers, what fishers actually do, how much effort they put into it, how much they care about it, how much they visit it, etc., is part and parcel of the argument for defending it. They have a vested interest in defending it. And you just have to be really careful. You just draw that away, that vested interest gone. Well, don't have to worry too much about the fish farms, do we? Because, you know, we're not losing the economic benefit of the people doing the fishing, etc. So if you want to have a complete moratorium, it's a moratorium with a plan, not just a moratorium, I suspect.
You're talking about using the catchment as the integrated unit. I mean, to a certain extent, it's taking the subjectivity out of the decision-making, isn't it? It's looking at it from as an impartial way as possible. Is it actually happening? I mean, what is stopping? Is it happening in other European countries? Are there good examples that you can look to where that is successful?
Well, the good news is everybody's beginning to understand they have to do rivers on a catchment basis. Even our water regulators think that it's actually at least worthy of paying lip service to catchment management. But when we were doing the Natural Capital Committee and we were sort of developing the 25-year plan and the stuff that went into the 221 Environment Act, we had an example of the Eden up in Cumbria. And we got the parties together to discuss what a catchment might look like. And they had loads of ideas. But the critical thing was nobody was in charge. Nobody could actually make decisions, so it had to be lowest common denominator. What I have in mind is something slightly more radical than that. I have in mind that instead of having Ofwat and water regulators, we would have catchment regulation. The catchment regulator would be responsible for drawing up a plan, trying out these various ideas. There would then be a plan, and then instead of water companies deciding how many holes in the ground they're going to put for some tanks and take the extra bits in, people would bid to do this stuff. So farmers would bid in to do some of the works which are in the catchment plan, and you'd be able to see what's in that framework. And I think that's what I call moving from catchments are a good idea, which I think that argument's been won, to the things, well, how do you make it happen? Who's responsible? Who's in charge? Who has to make this happen? Who's accountable for the outcomes? And as long as we have economic regulation in the old-fashioned sense, particularly the water industry, Scotland's slightly different. We won't get there. And that's why I proposed a catchment regulation system and the abolition of Ofwat. For different reasons, government seems quite keen on that now, but at least the Ofwat bit. But this has to be changed. This has to be a unit of authority, and the bidding brings the parties in, and that's really important. It's not just say, I'd like to help. It is, so what do you want to do? How much do you need to be paid to do this compared with, for example, in my canal around Oxford example, how much do I have to pay the Wildlife Trust to flood their land versus the 200 million I have to pay for the Environment Agency to dig a large canal? These are choices. You can get better results.
Are government ministers listening?
Oh, yeah, but not for the reasons you might think, right? I mean, right now, governments, and it reflects the wider population, we all want to live beyond our environmental means. People don't like the bills going up. And one of the convincing arguments for the catchment approach is it couldn't be more expensive than it is at the moment, right? So if you want to do it in a way that people can afford to pay what's required, it's beholden on you to use that money in a more effective way. And I think looking at it from a catchment process in a formal way, in a regulatory way, will get better outcomes. But never delude yourself that government ministers are sitting there thinking, how can I make the environment a better place? They're thinking, how many votes are there in the next election? And most people in our green and whatever land live in urban areas. 80% of the population live in urban areas, and actually for day-to-day life it's not important to them.
For Dr. Connor, are the huge percentage increases in the Russian sector due to the increased stocks or increased fishing pressure and unsustainable takes?
And are they true?
That's a whole other topic. I mean, it's hard to say. I think there's a confluence of factors that are at play. So we talked about, northern latitudes generally being more productive for salmon. So in part that's due to climate change. So kind of the Bering Sea and the Arctic are becoming more favorable for salmon. You have, richer food sources there. So you have these really fatty, lipid-rich foods, zooplankton, that are in abundance there. So salmon generally are moving north, and that's certainly at play and contributing. But you do also have kind of human augmented means. So you are seeing record scale industrial hatchery releases from some of those countries on the North Pacific Rim. And so it's hard to kind of, these things are conflated in terms of what the contributions are, but it's a confluence of the two.
The question that you posed in the beginning is interesting. How many are there? What kind of developments in technology do we have or do you see on the horizon to get better numbers and better figures? I mean, obviously, in Ireland, it's exactly the same, 1 million returning in the 1970s. I think the recent number is 170,000 returning. So it's exactly the same line going down, down, down. But is there a need for getting more precise data about what's going on?
Well, the way to get more precise data is to have more monitoring, to be monitoring more rivers, because those numbers are all based on a subset of rivers that are heavily monitored. So we have understandings of the number of salmon that go out and then come back. And then those are then extrapolated up to all of the other rivers. Obviously, if your subset of data-rich rivers was twice as big, you would have a better understanding there. There are some assumptions about the life of the salmon at sea, which are applied within that. And if we had a better understanding of the reasons why they were not surviving from going out to coming back, we could apply different numbers into the models that model that life cycle, which would help. But principally, to get a better precision, you need to have more numbers and a better representation of those numbers.
Is there a long way to go in that?
There's a lot more that could be done. It's obviously like everything else, it costs a huge amount of money and against it.
Katrina, we have a question here. Are we seeing, where's the question? What contribution does logging make to Pacific salmon decline in the northern regions of Canada, and how influential is salmon management in controlling this?
It's a tough, I don't have the percentage at my fingertips here, but it kind of comes back to the accumulation of pressure. So it's not just deforestation, it's logging, it's that how it intersects with disease, how that intersects with road development, another source of deforestation, all of which serves to degrade freshwater salmon habitats. So it's very difficult to draw that link. We know that there can be adverse effects for salmon survival, but it's very hard to kind of quantify, this is the percent decline in salmon attributed to that.
And Dieter, how can we get access and scale to the satellite data catchment modelling across Europe?
Well, my proposal in the comprehensive spending review that's going on at the moment, and this is a draconian comprehensive spending review, the Treasury is looking at the entire spending by government departments and their agencies through the Parliament, rather than a shorter period, is that DEFRA in particular, with the Environment Agency, I'm thinking England, that's my kind of territory, essentially becomes a digital department, and that there's a centralised, or reasonably centralised, digital capacity. They run the models. The catchment stuff is all open access, free. The actual satellites, there's tons of them. I mean, there's no difficulty on that front. I mean, that's where, this opportunity is urgent, because it's all analog at the moment, right? It's all boots on the ground, and I've got a lot of respect for people on the ground, and there's always a case where someone should be looking, right? But we can do so much more, dare I say it, for so much less in terms of cost to do this. But, we have to have that in place. And I'm not a sort of design expert on this kind of thing as to whether you want a single system or you want a series of systems. but I think shine the torch very clearly, make it absolutely clear that anyone's ideas are being tested out and shown as they affect, and make all this open access so everyone can see. I think it's not a revolution, but it's pretty much close. And much as I have very grave difficulties with a lot of the ideas, there's actually an idea that Dominic Cummings had, which is digitalising government. And that's going to happen anyway. AI, all that stuff's coming to government. But this is the chance to do it. To get this stuff built, get it up there, and get it so that anyone in this room can go home and say, I want to look at my catchment and see what this is. And I've got this idea I've been working on. You know, I've been thinking about what would happen to the quality of the water if the dogs stopped going in the rivers and the veterinary drugs weren't going in there, for example. Well, what would happen? You know, and then you use all the data that's collected along rivers, which is pretty crude, to put it together. I mean, it's not that long ago, months, when we didn't even know whether sewers were spilling out sewage into rivers, right? A very eminent person I know, Peter Hammond, sat in his cottage by the Windrush. He's a retired mathematician with his laptop and worked out what was going on from the sewers using satellite data. And that has actually transformed the debate about sewage in rivers in England. So fantastic opportunity, but it should be done as a public good, not lots of private companies trying to make money out of fiddling around with what offsets look like and biodiversity bits, etc., for the interests of the parties.
And as you say, using AI to run models and answer the kind of what-if scenarios in real time, almost.
Yeah. And just think about what AI can do. I mean, it's really about being able to crunch data in an extraordinarily more valuable way. And it also makes the value of recruiting this data much better, because you can improve your policy in this catchment by using more data, and then you end up saying, what's the missing bit? More data, more and more and more and more data. And you start to find incredibly interesting bits of that. I mean, in the Barlin Exmoor, which I know and Mark knows, I mean, one of the interesting questions is, so how much are people valuing this natural capital, which includes the salmon, etc.? Well, you know, what about the data from people's photographs? Which things are most photographed? What do they take pictures of? You know, it sounds very odd, but it tells you immediately how valuable they find the fish in this frame. And again, you know, it's sort of out there to do.
Alan, just a quick word on the nature restoration law and the barriers, and much as what has just been mentioned, I'm mindful of the Amber project, where people going for a walk were asked when they found a barrier to log it, and it immediately logged it on this app, and it was an incredible map to see what we didn't know, which was the extent of barriers on rivers. How hopeful are you? Under the nature restoration law, we have this 25,000 kilometres of river, and they're hoping to pull the barriers out as soon as possible across Europe. How hopeful are you for the Atlantic in that measure will boost numbers and really help salmon do the thing they need to do, which is get up the rivers to spawn? Slightly embarrassing. That's an EU law. It doesn't apply in the UK.
Yeah.
So we haven't really had much to do with it, but I'm aware of it. And the mapping, it looks a fantastic opportunity, and it seems to have, from what I've heard, particularly in Ireland, I'm aware of, there's a lot of money behind it to actually do something, rather than just having a law that says you must do. There's a facility to make it happen. And improving connectivity in that way is extremely exciting and promising. One caveat, unfortunately, is that that's what they did in Denmark before the nature restoration law. And Denmark was bucking the trend. It's not the only thing they've been doing to restore their rivers, but it was one of the major things. And their stocks were bucking the trend, and signs are not so good in recent times.
But just on that point about people being able to log stuff up, this is really important. And using the immense interest that people have in the state of their rivers and the citizen science data that goes with it. It's not just the data is really useful. It's the fact these people feel they can engage and they can actually contribute something and make it better. And that, you know, getting school kids to take over their bit of the river, to monitor it, to learn some science doing it. Again, if you can see the data being used and show how it plays out in the catchment, that's a real opportunity. And if you don't get kids involved, well, you know, they're the generation. They really matter in this.
Okay, then we're going to have to move on from this session. Any other questions from the audience before we move on? We'll take one. We'll take the lady here. And we'll keep it brief and then we'll wrap. Thank you. If you could just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hello and thank you. I come from the state of Maine, where there are 8 rivers left, and those are the only ones in the United States that have wild Atlantic salmon populations. How much of what we're calling climate change is simply temperature change, and that it's too warm for the Atlantic salmon?
Dr. Connors.
I mean, I think it's hard certainly to quantify that. I think climate change is the icing on the cake. Everything else that we're doing to, make survival challenging for salmon, climate change just exasperates that. So it makes all of the kind of weather extremes, more frequent, more intense. So it's maybe not the thing, but it's kind of the final straw, which really just kind of sets salmon back in terms of recovery.
Alan, do you have anything to say about that?
No, I think I'll leave that one.
And we will have time for one very quick question here, and then we'll move on. If you could just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Frederick Mowinkle. A quick question for Katrina. If you can say a few words about the Cohen Commission and the influence that has had on the Fraser River in particular.
Yeah, great question. So just for people's reference, I'll just say, so the Cohen Commission was a federal inquiry into the decline of Fraser River sockeye. So for context for folks, as I mentioned, the Fraser River watershed is the largest salmon-bearing watershed in Canada, and it had the most abundant population of salmon, in this case sockeye, in Canada. And they were historically abundant, 30 million plus, and they declined about 2009 to 3-4 million. And so there's inquiry as to why and what can we do about it. In terms of whether it's effective, I would say somewhat. I think in part it kind of shed light on, hey, we're at a crisis point. We need to do something different. We can't take for granted this abundance that we've been seeing for hundreds of years. It called out some major policies that were implemented at a national level, and in particular something called the Wild Salmon Policy in Canada. And that policy really says everything we've been saying is that you need to conserve diverse populations and their diverse habitats. And it really shed light on saying if we don't do that, we will have no prospects of recovering salmon. I would say the policy still has not been implemented in a lot of the work that the Pacific Salmon Foundation is trying to advance that. But I think overall, I think it hasn't recovered the state of salmon, and certainly we're seeing kind of the lowest returns for Fraser sockeye year after year. So we haven't gotten that return to abundance as we would hope with a commission like that.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to draw this session to a close. Please put your hands together to thank Dr. Alan Walker, Dr. Katrina Connors, and Professor Helm. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Well, we've heard the science, the data, and the facts. It's now time to create a little bit of space for thought and creativity. It's time for Salmon School, and I'm delighted to introduce our next 2 guests. We are joined by renowned artist Joseph Rossano, an artist, environmentalist, and salmon fisherman whose work explores themes of extinction, natural history, taxonomy, and conservation using wood, glass, photography, and other repurposed materials. In a recent interview I read, he said, "For much of my career, especially when working for others, my goal and responsibility was to make things that were beautiful. While beauty remains a very important component of what I do, it is no longer my end goal. Beauty has instead become the lead-in to a much larger message, a component that lures the viewer into a discussion of larger issues. I want my work to actually do something for those unable to speak." He is joined by Scott Schulyer, member and elder of the Upper Skagit Tribe, the indigenous people that has for thousands of years inhabited the Skagit Valley in the northwest portion of the state of Washington. And they consider their river to be sacred. He's the natural and cultural policy representative for the Upper Skagit, and he's currently working on a petition for listing for protection to the federal government under the Endangered Species Act for the Skagit River chum salmon. So please put your hands together for both of them. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Joe Rossano, and I want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to thank Fishmongers for having us here. And I'm an artist, as you've learned, and I'm going to let Scott.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Schulyer. I'm a member of the Upper Skagit Indian Tribe, and I want to say it's an honor to be here today. Thank you.
So this is going to be a slightly more organic program than I think what you all have been used to, because while I understand the scientific process, I also understand that we're trying to quantify something that doesn't necessarily want us to do that. So let's see what we can do together. The Salmon School was born out of the idea that if you give people the opportunity to give what they can to something they care about, no matter how big or how small, you can create a community of people that may change how we value the world. And this project is, and what we're doing together is sort of a manifestation of that. And the goal is to have salmon into perpetuity. The people who have taught me about the natural world said, you know, you really should have seen it yesterday. You should have been here 30 or 40 years ago. My name's Joseph Rossano, and I am an artist that strives to give an audience a different perspective about the world that surrounds them. So this piece that I'm working on with a number of people, and this number of people is growing, it's a performance piece designed to bring a community in to talking to the world about why salmon and steelhead are important, why they are in many ways like the passenger pigeon, a seemingly endless resource, and they're in jeopardy throughout the range of salmon and steelhead. I can say that I've been conscious of what's been happening, say, here on the Skagit River for over 30 years. If we can show, say, starting with the Skagit, which is the 4th largest outflow of the Pacific, what the smallest return of fish looked like to this river in a gallery setting, where we make, 2,405 steelhead out of glass, it can reflect ourselves, the viewer, and put it in context. I'm taking all of this information, saying, how do I condense it into one representation of a piece that talks about salmon in the world? So, as I said, this is going to be a little organic. Scott and I are going to have a conversation about what we can do to be better stewards together. And I'd like to say, and this might be a little emotional for me, and it should be emotional for everybody who cares about salmon, the places they live, the people, everything in the ecosystem on which salmon depend. So if I get a little watery, please forgive me. So on January 22nd, I left my home in Seattle area and began my journey east from the shores of the Salish Sea for this conference. 170 years ago, the ancestors of my esteemed colleague, Scott, and likely the ancestors of some in this room, signed the Point Elliott Treaty. In that treaty, indigenous signees of the Salish Sea ceded 54,000 acres of land in return for reservations for their homes and for their people, and eternal hunting and fishing rights. I would like to acknowledge that my work and home are born of the ceded lands of the Elliott tribal assignees. And I'd like to thank Scott, and at this point, Scott and I are going to have a conversation about how we can be better together at managing salmon and the places that it depends on. So I'm ceding the floor to Scott, and I'll ask him a couple of questions.
All right, before you do that, Joe, just a little bit about my ancestor. His name was Pateus, and it was important enough for our people to continue our way of life, practice our way of life. Our treaty was centric to retaining the rights to salmon on the Skagit River, so we're very fortunate to have all 6 species of salmon on the river. And by signing this treaty, again, we reserved the rights to fish in perpetuity, and it averted war with the Americans. But over the last 170 years, we've done everything we possibly could to ensure that the salmon do not survive. We've built dams, we've logged our watersheds, we've developed our riverbanks, and so we have to do better. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joe again.
All right, Scott. So we have to have a shared mission. What is that? In order for salmon to live into perpetuity, we have to have a shared mission. What do you think that looks like?
For our collective shared mission, I think everybody here is under the same auspice of we need to do better. We need to ensure that salmon survive. You know, by ensuring that salmon survive, we ensure our own survival. And I've heard it from the speakers today already. You know, we can't do this alone. It's got to be a collective effort, not by one individual, not by multiple individuals, but by countries. It's got to be a global effort. And so that's why we're here today. Salmon bring everybody together. Thank you.
So how do we connect the dots to ensure that salmon and humans survive, and how do we work together to improve the relationship for all stakeholders?
Well, salmon are the bridge builders, again, bringing us all together. Understanding each other's needs, values, and cultures, I think, is a good first step to the path to recovery. You know, there are some positive things that are occurring out there. On the Skagit, we brought back a run of salmon that was nearly extinct 30 years ago. The Baker River sockeye went down to 80 fish in 1985, and we negotiated with one of the dam operators to fix what they were doing wrong, if you would. And we brought that run size up to 65,000 2 years ago. So there are successes, but they take work and continued maintenance.
So what is the role of youth in the future of salmon? You know, what are some examples of that success?
Well, as we all know, youth are the future, and some of the other speakers have already touched on this. In our tribal teachings, we also teach our kids that they are the future. We have to leave things better for them and give them the building blocks for their future. Again, we're borrowing today from them as we speak, and we have an obligation to fix and repair what we can right now, and again, give them the tools through environmental education, lay the foundation for these runs, make sure they don't go extinct so they have the building blocks.
So is there any one thing that helps everyone become a better steward of the planet for salmon?
Yeah, again, I guess making sure that we all, you know, are on the same page as far as understanding the values that we have today, the quality of life that we enjoy today, and ensure that it's, again, here for the future, I think.
Fantastic. So I would like to say that, in addition to what Scott's saying, that this sculpture has traveled around the world. It's been to the Global Climate Change Summit, and many in this room helped make that happen. It's been shown at the Bellevue Art Museum, the Museum of Glass. It's going to be broken into different parts and shown in different parts of the United States over the next couple of years. And the goal was to have this project be a microcosm of the people in the room, in this room, and the people that we touch. And for that to allow youth to inform how we move forward. So the Salmon School, as a result of being a participant at COP26, has evolved a community science program. You've met some of the youth that were involved in that program. And we are now a UN Ocean of the Decade endorsed program. And the goal is to give people the opportunity at a young age to see reality, and for that reality to inform how we go forward. And thank you. So we're going to show another video. Did you want to add anything else?
Well, just, youth, they have the clarity that some of us adults don't have, the ability to see what is wrong and see solutions that sometimes that are right in front of our face. That's obvious for them, but not so much for us. And so we learn from our children. So we agreed that we would only talk for about 6 minutes. We have a couple of minutes left before we show the last video. You're doing great. do you want to add? Much better than myself. Is there anything else you'd like to say? Well, just, it's a sad state that we're in right now, and I've walked this earth for over 60 years now, and I've seen the last of many things on the Skagit River. I saw the last tribal Chinook, wild Chinook fishery in 1991, the last chum fishery in 2007, the last spring Chinook 35 years ago. And so this is a legacy that, I really don't want to leave for my kids. And again, I'm here to look to you guys for your leadership, your help, and offer whatever advice we can collectively do. So thank you.
From a cultural standpoint, it really was significant from our history to fish for steelhead. This is what we sustained ourselves on in these cold winter months. It was the only fish available, and it was there for us when we needed it the most. The Skagit's the largest run of steelhead in the Puget Sound, and it could be bigger. That's our hope. They are protected. When there are harvestable fish available, we can go out and exercise our treaty rights. It's my 44th year out here fishing. I love to fish. I love to be out on the river, to go out and honor the sacrifice of our ancestors and give meaning to the treaty by continuing to fish. To this very day, we get a lot of resistance. People look at it as a sport game type fish. For us, it has a meaning, for sustaining our people and our history and our culture. We look at it as food from our perspective. There's a steelhead right here. That's a male steelhead there. They're such a beautiful fish. Our ancestors, had never envisioned that the runs, would diminish to the extent that they have. If we give up our fishing culture, our heritage, what would the loss of our lands, bend for, if you would? When the opportunity arises to actually have a fishery, we're very, very thankful that, it still exists.
So we learn things a lot of ways. And one of the important things in my life is, verbal communication. And there's an oral history about our relationship with this throughout time. And the people that actually taught me about this river are people who worked with Scott, and who Scott and his people imbued with an understanding. And I just want to, suggest that maybe we have more to learn in how we go forward. So thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Joe. We all have something to learn.
I know.
We're here.
That's right.
Joe and Scott, thank you very, very much. And can I just be very superficial for a second and say I cannot believe Scott said he was 60 years walking this earth. He looks much younger than that. I'm delighted now, before we break for lunch, to ask the students, and a lot more of them, to come back on stage. It is obviously our responsibility, all of us, to do whatever's in our power to stand up for salmon for future generations. And the students from the Thames Salmon School, they're from 5 schools along the Thames. They've been working with Joe to learn about their local river, to visit the river itself, get their hands in the water, to make art, to do some science, and even use eDNA to sample the water. So they're from 9 years old to 12 years old. I'm going to read out their names, and they might be good enough to come on stage with me. We have Isla, Konstantinos, Kieran, Emily, Mia Rose, Nada, Lily Keane, Kelly, Emily, and Kieran. Do you want to come up here? Thank you so much for coming on. We're going to get you all together in front of me. I have 1,000,001 questions to ask you. I'm going to start with Mia Rose and Nada. Where's Mia Rose and Nada? Here we are. Now, there are so many things that are amazing about salmon, so many facts that we know that are just incredible. It's kind of mind-boggling to understand how they operate. But tell us your favorite facts about salmon.
So my best salmon facts are anadromous, which means they spend their life in both salt and fresh water. The next one is they are migrating fish, which means they take incredible journeys which we are impacting. And the last one is salmon have a great sense of smell, which is known to be their guide for their home so they can reproduce.
Which is just amazing, isn't it? Mia Rose, what are your favorite facts?
My favorite salmon facts are that salmon are a type of fish that live in fresh and salty water. I also know that salmons are endangered due to activities of humans, such as polluting the environment. Salmons can jump up to 3 meters high to get past obstacles like waterfalls. The sad thing is there are too many unnatural obstacles that they have to now put up with.
And that jumping, isn't that just amazing? Have you seen that on a video before? Yeah, isn't it phenomenal to see? It's like a high jumper going all the way up. Thank you so much. We have Isla. Where's Isla? And Konstantinos. Konstantinos, tell me a little bit about your river and what wildlife you saw in your river.
In our river, we saw a newt, a mallard duck, an eel, a chub, a bullhead, and a stone loach.
And Isla, what did you see?
I saw some fish like a roach, an eel, and I also saw a free-spine stickleback. And can I tell you a fact?
And you saw an eel?
Yeah.
You actually saw the eel, and you've drawn sketches of all of them, haven't you?
Yeah. We also saw a mallard duck, and a mallard duck. When it's a female, they have the sandy color. So when they are on their eggs, they protect them because they blend in the color of where, like the sand. So when there are any predators, the predators can't see them because they blend in.
Can't see them, and the males are so beautiful, aren't they, as well? So colourful and gorgeous. Thank you both so much. Kieran and Emily. Kieran's there behind you. Tell us a little bit about eDNA, Kieran.
We found 18 species of fish, including pike, eel, brown trout, minnows, 2 species of stickleback, and bream.
Amazing. And Emily, where's Emily? Emily, tell us what you found using eDNA.
So
Like Kieran said, we found 18 different species, and we also collected mud from the riverbank and mixed it with river water to make our own paint, and then we drew the river or animals that we saw, and it was very exciting because we knew that our artwork contained the eDNA of the environment, the river environment, so that was very exciting.
And did you have any idea beforehand just how much life there was in your river?
No.
No, it's amazing, yeah. Isla, where's Isla? Back to Isla again. Isla, talk a little bit about your river journal. There, you've been sketching some of the life that you found, haven't you?
So I thought I might see some. I thought I might see a duck, which I did see. I thought I might see an eel. I might see a tadpole, and I thought I saw a kingfisher. What I didn't, but I did see one in the morning when I was walking to the train station.
Did you?
Yeah. And we did some pictures of some DNA. So we stuck some leaves onto a sheet of paper, which looks like DNA. So they're in little rows, so it looked like little section of DNA. And so I also on this one I stuck some leaves onto the piece of paper, and then so it was in the sun with the we put some water in it as well. So when the sun went on it, when we took the leaves off, the leaves left a white patch on it, but the other bits were a darker blue to show where the leaves were and the where the leaves weren't.
It's absolutely beautiful. It's beautiful. And Konstantinos, you have a journal there as well, don't you? Tell us a little bit about what's inside of it.
Well, it's a bit same as Isla's, but we've also made a thing that it's the life cycle of the salmon.
You want to hold that up to show everyone? Very good. And did you know about the life cycle beforehand, Konstantinos?
No.
No. And what do you think about it now once you've understood it a bit?
It's more like understanding. I can understand how they live.
And how they do it, yeah. And how they come back to the same river to spawn as well. Mia Rose and Nada, what's been the most amazing part of the Salmon School for you? There's a microphone here.
I loved our trip to the river, which allowed me to see nature all around me, and being allowed to take samples from the river was exciting and interesting. I also loved making art out of natural resources, which is something I have never done before.
Like what? Like bits of wood, or what did you use?
We made it out of leaves, rocks. Some people used sticks and wood. So yeah.
Amazing. And Nada?
I loved how we could create different animals and things that we saw in the river. Like some people created a duck out of mud on the paper, and some people created leaves and with using metal wire. And I created a swan, and then I just sewed through the leaves through the metal and created the shape. Those were my favorite things.
Super. And thank you so much. Thank you so much. And it's lovely to hear you using all the bits and pieces from nature to create something beautiful. And I want to ask very quickly, Kelly here, and sorry, your name is Lily. Talk to us a little bit about your involvement in the Salmon School and what you did.
We were really excited to find evidence of different fish in our river, particularly the brown trout, as this was the species we were very interested in.
And Kelly?
We also found that there was stone lodge, northern pike, stickleback, gudgeon, minnow, and a common roach in our river, as well as evidence of cows.
And when you pass the river now, do you think of it differently now that you know all that life is in it? Yeah, because you wouldn't have known that before, did you? Like the rest of us, it's really easy to walk by a river and just not think too much about what's in there. And did you enjoy the Salmon School? Yeah, yeah. And Daniel, at the end, we're going to pass a microphone down to Daniel. Daniel, will you tell us a little bit about your involvement and what did you most enjoy?
Daniel's favourite part, so we're from a SEN school in Buckinghamshire, and so this is really new for us all. Daniel and his friend Azam are just two of the students that took part in the project, and they went out, and Daniel said that his favourite part was making the art by the river.
Because Azam, my best friend in Shannon.
Your cousin. Azam, do you want to take the microphone and tell us a little bit about what you want to say?
I like going to the river and just the water was dirty.
That's a very familiar story.
I like finding the insects in the water, and I like doing. We made salmon out of clay.
Beautiful.
Yeah, we painted it, just made it up. We just. Yeah, it was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel, as well. And Kelly and Lily, I want to ask you one final thing. You're in front of all these people here, and these people, some of them are very, very influential, and they can make things happen. What's your message to them?
Just to help our salmon and not make them be extinct.
Kelly?
I just want to thank them for today, and how much effort they put into helping the salmon and helping them to not be extinct.
Fantastic.
And they're really trying their best to help out with the salmon.
Well, the future is safe in all of your hands. We are so grateful for you for coming up and sharing everything that you've done. You're an inspiration. Thank you so much. Well done, Kelly. Well done. Well done. Well done. Thank you so much. Well done, Ellen. And thank you so much to Joe and Scott again as well. It's time for lunch now. So we're going to be back here, if you can keep an eye, to be back here at 1:45, 1:40 if you can, 1:45 to start. Before you go, tomorrow morning, it's going to be a very interesting morning. We have Norway's Minister of Climate and Environment coming, and also the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and the Islands. So you undoubtedly will have questions for them, and what we ask is if you wouldn't mind please getting the questions in through Slido or by email before today, before 5 o'clock. So if you do have questions you want to put to them, please could you just send through those questions. The more the merrier, quite frankly. We'll get as many questions as we can, but please, if you can, get them to us before 5 o'clock today. But most importantly now, go and have a lovely lunch, and we'll see you after lunch.